Is ADHD on the rise? New York Times investigative reporter Alan Schwarz is here to talk about his new book, ADHD Nation.
A lot of these kids were the quote-unquote good kids who were trying to get better grades to impress their parents and their teachers and college admissions officers. I mean, it was sick.
What makes graphic novels so popular among kids today? One of the genre's best-selling authors, Raina Telgemeier, will join me with our children's books editor, Maria Russo, to talk about her new book, Ghosts.
Do I believe in ghosts? I think I believe in memories. And I think I believe that the memories of people stick around for a really long time and we can keep them alive.
Think you could be a substitute teacher? Nicholson Baker, whose new book is called Substitute, Going to School with 1,000 Kids, joins us to tell us about life in front of the classroom.
They broke me, and I felt like just an absolute, completely inept human being.
Plus, we'll talk about what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. 1 in 7 American children today get diagnosed with ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. My colleague here at the Times, Alan Schwarz, is an investigative reporter who's covered ADHD for years. His new book is ADHD Nation, Children, Doctors, Big Pharma, and the Making of an American Epidemic. Alan, thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure.
You're back in the building.
I am. I love it.
And you are probably most well known for your incredible work on concussions.
Well, yes, it were my articles and the work of the sports department, the sports editors in general. But I wrote 120 to 130 articles over about 5 years that really explored and exposed the degree of danger that concussions can pose to not just National Football League players, which of course got a lot of attention, but to youth athletes and to girls and to really anybody, that concussions are not just a ding. They're a serious medical event. It got a lot of coverage.
You were a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes.
And how did you get from that to this research on ADHD?
Well, what happened was the NFL stuff just became so hot, and concussions, and I was going to be subpoenaed in lawsuits. And I became part of the story. And I decided that it was really unhealthy for me to continue covering the subject. And so I went into the education department.
Here at the Times.
Yes. I had heard that high school students in my native Westchester County, some of them, were snorting Adderall before the SATs.
Wow.
I was just so horrified. I had no interest in ADHD, the condition for which Adderall is typically prescribed. I didn't really even know much about Adderall abuse, certainly not personally. I saw it as an academic pressure story. What are we as grown-ups doing to these kids to have them be, compelled to snort this stuff? And it wasn't necessarily the kids who would normally be into alcohol and drugs, of which there are, of course, many. A lot of these kids were the quote-unquote good kids who were trying to get better grades to impress their parents and their teachers and college admissions officers. I mean, it was sick. It's absolutely sick.
So did it turn out to be all about parents putting pressure on their kids?
Absolutely not. It was, of course, parents, but also just the entire ethos of high school these days, and particularly high-pressure high schools like those found in Westchester County and private schools here in New York and really all over the country. One of the schools I looked at was Lower Merion High School outside Philadelphia, Harvard Westlake in the Los Angeles area. It's really all over. Wherever kids want to excel academically, it will be known to at least some degree that these medications can help you focus, stay up later to study. A lot of people misunderstand them as making you smarter.
Right.
They call them smart drugs, which they are not. They do not improve functional memory. They do not improve intelligence. What they do for many people, not all, is increase their tolerance for tedious tasks.
Right.
And that can include cleaning your closet, and it can include rote math questions and studying textbooks. And, you can focus more and bang out work faster. Not necessarily better, but faster.
But these drugs, Ritalin and Adderall and the like, were not intended for the quote-unquote good students. They were intended as medication for children diagnosed with ADHD.
Correct. And in fact, they've been around a heck of a lot longer than most people realize. In the late 1930s, what we now call Adderall was used by mistake in some ways, or certainly serendipitously. And it was discovered that, holy cow, unruly children calmed down.
It's such a disturbing idea at its foundation in a lot of ways, that many of the behaviors that are kind of within the normative range of human behavior for children have become, that you can quote unquote improve upon them.
Well, the thing is that ADHD and its forerunner, minimal brain dysfunction, which is what ADHD was known as before 1980, and of course, rambunctiousness, inattention, impulsivity, hyperactivity, all children display that to some degree. Mm-hmm. And thankfully, we live in a society where if you are so impaired by certain behaviors, as we try to educate everybody, sometimes they would, in the past, they would just be left to, spin off into the wilderness.
Left behind.
Absolutely. We live in a society where we say, you know what, the most severely impaired by these types of behaviors can be considered candidates for a disorder, okay, where there are criteria, and if you meet those criteria, and the criteria used to be far more strict, they've been loosened virtually every couple of years for ADHD, the idea is that we will intervene with various treatments, or at least offer those treatments to, in this case, parents. That's wonderful. We, I think, want a certain segment of children who are so impaired by their behavioral issues. We want to help them. And if putting this label, this categorization on them affords them behavioral interventions, help in school, and up to and including medication, God bless them.
Right.
That's fine. The question is, what segment of children are we calling seriously impaired and, frankly, disordered?
Well, it seems like it's one of those diagnoses that, from many people's point of view, like autism spectrum disorder, that there's a wide range. And then people wonder, so many more children are being diagnosed with ASD and with ADHD and its various permutations. Do more kids have this, or is it overdiagnosis?
Well, I like to call it misdiagnosis, okay? Because there are, yes, a lot of kids being diagnosed with ADHD who do not have it, but there are also some kids out there who would qualify for a diagnosis who are not being treated, and we don't want to forget about them either. What we want is to be more accurate in our diagnoses. Now, right now, okay, the DSM, which is psychiatry's official manual where all the experts all over the world, or at least in America specifically, have gotten together and the consensus has been reached that this is what the disorder at least is for now. This is how we're going to define it and diagnose it. And by the way, ADHD affects approximately 5% of school-aged children. Okay. That's the benchmark that the experts have said is fair. Now, of course, I think we all could live with maybe even 7 or 8% because we live in the real world and okay, fine. The problem is that 15% of American children get diagnosed with ADHD by the time they turn 18. 20% of American boys across the country, 1 in 5, get told there is something wrong with your brain.
Right.
And my feeling is that if you're going to tell a kid there's something wrong with your brain, you better damn well be right.
Especially, as you pointed out, more boys are diagnosed with this, more minority children who tend to be the younger kids in the classroom. So it's discriminating against and stigmatizing certain kids, probably unnecessarily.
Well, I think that the differences in ethnicity, diagnosis rates and even wealth, okay, they're not that huge. Every segment of children is being diagnosed more than the DSM would suggest. It's just some are more misdiagnosed than others. And it's fine. Boys have always been more hyperactive, and they will always be impaired by hyperactivity more than girls. Okay? I mean, that's just sort of the way the human race has evolved. And so we want to intervene with those boys more. But we have to take a look at if 12%, say, of African Americans across the country are diagnosed with ADHD right now, and maybe 17 during their childhoods.
17%.
17%. I mean, that's millions.
Yes.
Millions of children being told there's something wrong with you.
Let's talk a little bit about the business side to this, because I imagine that means a very big market for the pharmaceutical industry. What role has the industry played in ADHD awareness, ADHD diagnosis, and treatment?
Well, let me just make clear to all the parents out there of ADHD children who are now very annoyed, saying you think it doesn't exist and you're trying to, put down or stigmatize my child. And that is absolutely not true. All I'm saying is that there are a lot of children out there who are misdiagnosed, and we need to care and do better for them. And for the ones who are legitimately diagnosed, absolutely. Go ahead. Give treatments. Give them medication. I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do. Now, getting to your point is that we should intervene with these children, and to the extent that medication is an option, there's nothing wrong with pharmaceutical companies coming up with beneficial treatments for all sorts of ailments, up to and including ADHD. The issue is that because ADHD does not have a definitive test, it is basically an opinion of the doctors and the parents and the teachers that this child is impaired by these behaviors. And of course, that's very subjective. Doesn't mean it isn't real, but it makes it hard.
Right. A lot of those criteria in the DSM-5 can be vague and can be applied to many children.
Yeah, has difficulty finishing tasks. Now, of course, lots of children. And again, I'm not putting it down. It's just the way that the psychiatric establishment, and more than pharma, okay, I put it more on the psychiatric establishment, has made the rules so loose that basically you could diagnose any kid you want. And sometimes that was done in good faith because they didn't want any kid with problems to slip through the cracks. The problem is that, to mix metaphors, a lot of dolphins have been caught in their tuna nets.
Right.
Yes, pharma benefits from this, but they put out ads beginning in 2000 that enticed parents to get their kids diagnosed in ways that I like to think we would look back upon now and question the spirit of these things. Promising parents that these drugs will, allow your kid to show his true intelligence, grades that will match his intelligence.
Right.
They promise that your kid will take out the garbage.
It's almost like you're not allowing your child to fulfill his or her true potential unless you give them the benefit of this.
Absolutely. And of course, for kids with serious ADHD, it probably did deliver that. Okay. But it also will help basically any child, perhaps to less of a degree, okay, because improvement in these areas is less noticeable in kids who have fewer of these problems. But unfortunately, a lot of doctors foolishly and irresponsibly and unconscionably would say, you know what, he's having trouble concentrating. Let's give him this Concerta or Adderall and see if it helps. But the problem with that is that it's going to help just about any kid. So it's the equivalent of saying, give him these platform shoes, see if they make him taller.
Right.
And when, of course, it helps the kid, they say, whoop, he had ADHD. And then the kid thinks he has ADHD for the rest of his life.
With the investigative reporting you did on concussions, that is obviously leading to change. I'm assuming that your goal with ADHD Nation is also to lead to awareness and change. What do you think should be done? I'm
trying to give parents a view of how this disorder has evolved over more than 50 years. The first congressional hearing on overdiagnosis of what we now call ADHD and overmedication was in 1970. Most people don't realize that this has been going on for a long time. And it has now reached the point where I like to think people are going to say, holy cow, we are not doing as well for our children as we should. We should diagnose and treat when appropriate, and when not, we should find other solutions for the child's problems. So all I hope is that we're more judicious and doctors just do a better job of identifying the right kids and not putting the label on the kids who don't have this problem. They may have other problems, but those problems, perhaps Adderall is not the solution. In fact, it can exacerbate it. So you just have to be a lot more judicious, spend the 3 to 5 weeks that it's supposed to take to make a real evaluation and diagnosis. Don't do it in 20 minutes. I don't care how long your waiting room line is.
Well, our back to school issue this year, the theme is tough lessons. So this sounds like it very much fits into that. Alan, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
The book is called, again, ADHD Nation, Children, Doctors, Big Pharma, and the Making of an American Epidemic by Alan Schwarz. I'm very excited to introduce and have here Raina Telgemeier, whose latest graphic novel is Ghosts, as well as our children's books editor, Maria Russo. Hi, guys.
Hi.
Welcome
Pamela.
to the show.
Thank you.
So we were just talking about the whole idea of comic books versus graphic novels amongst ourselves. And I wanted to kind of raise that question. Like, are they the same thing? Are they different? How do you think of what you do?
Graphic novels are comics, but not all comics are graphic novels. So comics is kind of the format and the all-purpose term for sequential art and storytelling. So a comic can be 1 page long, but it can also be 400 pages long. So people think of the word comics, and they often think of kind of the standard 24-page floppy weekly or monthly format comic book. But graphic novels are comics too.
That sounds so inclusive. How many graphic novels have you written so far?
Ghosts will be my 4th original graphic novel, but I also illustrated for Babysitter's Club graphic novels, which were adapted from Anne M. Martin's original novels.
Classics.
Yes, from the 80s and 90s from my childhood.
So your first graphic novel was Smile.
Technically, the first graphic novel that was published with my name on it was the first Babysitter's Club book, Christie's Great Idea, in 2006. 4 of those came out before Smile was published, and Smile came out in 2010.
Okay, but that was
my
the first that you wrote, and it is an original.
Yeah, my first writing, illustrating,
And
everything.
Smile was really autobiographical, right?
Yes, it was.
Tell us the story about Smile just quickly.
Well, when I was in middle school, I had a really traumatic accident where I tripped and fell and knocked out my 2 front permanent teeth, and then had to spend the rest of middle school and half of high school without them. So that meant braces and headgear and surgeries and false teeth, and sort of those years of my life, instead of just focusing on the normal teen stuff, I was also focusing on what my face looked like and making it look normal again. So, I mean,
They look lovely,
Yeah,
by the way.
thanks. They're
Let's just
sick.
say that for those who are only listening to this.
Thank you, modern orthodontia. But this, it's an experience that stays with you for sure. And I think it really had an effect on who I became as a person. So 20 years later, I was still thinking about it. I was still telling people that story. And I realized I just needed to get the whole thing down on paper. And I had been making short form autobiographical comics for a very long time. So it was just sort of a natural extension of what I was doing anyway. And then I made it into a long form story, and Scholastic offered to publish it.
And so drama came after that.
That's right.
And what was the story behind drama?
Drama came from my theater days in high school and middle school, where I was just on, in all the school plays and all the school musicals, and never in like a leading role, but just kind of part of the gang. And I wanted to write a story from the point of view of the kids backstage. And particularly not the kids who were always in the spotlight, but the ones who were kind of backstage running the lights and the scenery and costumes and stuff. So I focused on the stage crew in a story. And even though I was never in stage crew, I felt like it was a fun way to sort of project me and my friends and our experiences.
One of the things that I think is so interesting and daring in a way, although I think that the children's book community has made a lot of progress in this, is that you don't shy away from issues in these books. And
Right.
Drama, I think, was intended for a middle grade reader for 8 to 12, or would you say 10 and up?
I believe it was 10 and up.
10 and up.
Yeah.
But even so, I remember my daughter reading it and saying, "Mommy, Did you know there's a gay character in this book? You deal with it in a very organic way.
Thank you. I mean, it came from me and my friends and just observing what kids were up to. And again, these were experiences that I had 20 years ago. So things really have changed since then. And I had the full support of my editors, and I had the full support of my, at that point, pretty devoted fan base.
And it was also, you didn't turn it into an issue book about that. It
Right.
just was, this is part of the story, and this is part of the, this
drama
is what
community.
children are going through.
Exactly. And I mean, hearing from readers after writing that book, and still to this day, I get amazing, amazing letters from tweens, and they want to tell me their personal stories. I feel like I'm getting a gift from them.
Like you're enabling people to kind of share their own stories.
Definitely. Yeah, I think, and that's something that happens with autobiography too, is you write about yourself and you think you're writing just one person's very specific experience. But it seems like the more specific you get, the more universal your story can become. And people go, oh, I can relate to that thing.
Well, I can definitely say that about your next book, which was Sisters.
Yes.
It was one of the great sister stories
Thank
in
you.
children's literature.
What was the inspiration behind that? Another autobiographical?
Yes. The inspiration was my sister, believe it or not. That story sort of was born out of the fact that kids read Smile and they just wanted to know more. They wanted to know more about my life and my family and my friends. And instead of deciding to write a sequel to Smile, as far as like what came next in my life, I kind of went backwards and looked at my life from the time I was a very small child and just what my family dynamics were like. And I have a really interesting relationship with my sister and wanted to explore that. So I think for me, writing autobiography is sometimes just a way to be like, this thing happened to me. I need to process it somehow. What conclusions can I draw from it? And often when I start writing the book, I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know what the conclusion will be. But in that 2-year process that it takes me to create a graphic novel, it's like this huge wave of catharsis.
Your new book is called Ghosts. Did this have an autobiographical origin as well?
Nothing in Ghosts is something that comes directly from my life, but this is a story that deals with mortality and with kids thinking about death, because one of the characters has a chronic illness. It's cystic fibrosis, and that's a disease that will probably shorten a person's lifespan from the average. And so she's 8, she's dealing with it, and she's a super happy kid, and she's just like, I'm going to squeeze everything out of my life as I have it. I did have a young cousin with a terminal illness a few years ago, and we ultimately lost her to cancer, unfortunately. And just sort of seeing what her family was going through and the love that they had for one another was incredibly powerful, as you can imagine. And it's not those people, it's not those characters, but it was definitely something that stuck with me.
And one of the things that makes this book so powerful is that you put that mortality theme inside an exploration of Day of the Dead, the Mexican tradition. And how did that happen for you?
I mean, growing up in California, I was friends with a lot of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and so being in their homes and sort of eating dinner with them, you just hear people's stories, and I love hearing people's stories. And I had a lot of friends and family who I spoke to and just wanted to know specifically what their relationship with their culture was. And I'm really interested in like second and third generation Americans who have this culture in their lives, and it's really, really important. But sometimes when you're a teenager, you forget about it, or you think that it's not as important to you anymore, so you can just do your own thing. But then you get a little bit older and you realize, gosh, maybe I would like to connect with my past a little bit.
I think a question that people often have for children's books authors is, do you set out to teach children something? Do you have a message? Do you want them to draw something from it? And I think probably very bad children's books, only do that and nothing else. And it's very deliberate. But is there something that you wanted to accomplish or to bring to children in this book that was different from your previous ones?
For me, I mean, writing is usually just about a question rattling around inside my head. What is this thing? Or what can I learn more about this particular thing? And so with Day of the Dead, I was just really curious about the celebration and the history behind it, and what people took away from it. And so the idea of finding comfort in death and comfort in your loved ones leaving you was really appealing to me. And so I don't think it was setting out for me to teach anybody anything, rather to answer my own questions and come to my own conclusions. And of course, death is not a question anybody can answer, but it's something we can think about and talk about.
And there's another thing in the book that I know the kids are going to really respond to is the question of, are ghosts real? Are there really ghosts among us?
It is a good question. I've been asked that on stage already. For me, the answer to that question is, do I believe in ghosts? I think I believe in memories. And I think I believe that the memories of people stick around for a really long time and we can keep them alive.
And that's clearly what happens in the book in this town that you've created. So tell us about the town you created.
Yeah. Well, so I grew up in
Fictional.
San Francisco. Yeah. And there are a lot of little towns around San Francisco on the coast that are just kind of these gloomy, misty, windswept, mysterious places. And I wanted to evoke a lot of those places. So I created a town called Bahia de la Luna. And it's kind of inspired by Half Moon Bay, which is a town in California where they have a lot of like pumpkin farms. So despite the fact that it's windy and foggy and beachy and weird, it's also like this Halloween-y town. And so the media shows us a lot of like Halloween on the East Coast and in places like Massachusetts, and you see a lot of like fall leaves and harvest moons.
It's our holiday here.
Yeah, I love Halloween. I adore it. But Halloween was not like that
On the West
on
Coast.
the coast of Northern California. Yeah. No. So I think I just wanted to capture the essence of that. And so there's a really specific color palette in this book. And I worked very, very closely with my colorist, Braden Lamb, to kind of create that palette and the atmosphere. And I sent him 1,000 photos from a photo shoot trip that I took a couple of years ago in the summertime when it's really, really, really cold there.
I think that very notion that there's a colorist who works on these books is probably surprising to other people who don't write graphic novels. How does that work?
I have always worked in black and white, and I think it's because I was inspired by black and white comics myself growing up. I was reading a lot of comic strips in the newspaper, and the dailies were always in black and white. And then I was reading alternative graphic novels and manga when I was a kid. And so I just didn't even think twice about making black and white comics myself. But ever since the publication of Smile, we've just found that kids really like color in graphic novels, and who can blame them? It's beautiful. The colorist that I work with now, he's very good about just saying, like, what do you envision? Do you want this to be cold? Do you want it to be hot? Is it daytime? Is it nighttime? Is it interpretive? Is it very literal? I mean, I love seeing the world in color. I just don't feel I'm as good at creating it on the page. I go into my Photoshop palette to choose a color for something, and I'm more like, this is red, this is blue, this is green, and not this is nuanced. But Braden's really good at seeing the nuance, and he's really good at sort of pushing that color palette towards an emotional space. So I try to create as much emotion and drama and build up of the story through the characters and through the story itself and just the narrative. But having somebody who understands color takes it to a whole nother level.
Now, we're talking right here before the book is actually out, but I'm assuming that some children have read this book already and have shared their reactions with you.
Yeah.
What have you heard?
I've talked to more adults who have read it than children at this point, but I'm hearing a lot of people's stories. It's the same thing with when I write autobio, that people who have lost somebody will come up to me and they'll just look me in the eyes, and sometimes they'll start crying. Then we have a moment, and it's like I don't even know what their story is yet, but I feel that connection to them immediately. So I'm going to have to bring some tissues with me on book tour, I think.
Definitely.
And that was Raina Telgemeier, whose latest graphic novel is Ghosts. Thank you so much for being here. And Maria Russo, our children's books editor.
Thanks, Raina and Pamela.
Thanks, you guys.
Want to find out what's in the new issue of the book review before everyone else does? Just go to nytimes.com/book review, scroll down the page, and search for our newsletter. Every Friday, you'll be the first to see reviews, news, and features in that week's issue. So please sign up. That's nytimes.com/book review. Acclaimed author Nicholson Baker does not seem to be the person you would most likely expect to find at the front of a classroom. He's written 15 books, 10 novels, and 5 works of fiction. But in 2014, Baker became an on-call substitute teacher for the public schools in Maine, where he lives. And then he wrote a book about it. That book is called Substitute, Going to School with 1,000 Kids. Nick, thank you for being here.
Oh, it's it's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
So how did you become a substitute teacher?
Well, technically speaking, it's kind of easy. You can take a class, your fingerprints are taken, and you fill out a form because there's a desperate need for substitutes. But the reason I did it was because I watched both of my dear children go through public school, and like every parent, I thought I had my little theories. I wanted to figure out what could be changed to make the whole thing better. Why did my daughter spend so many hours sitting at the table in the kitchen doing the homework, every night, and what went wrong? So I had theories, and that's what impelled me, I think, initially to want to write a book about education. But then I thought, I don't really know. I mean, I don't have any credentials. I'm just an interested bystander, and I thought, why not just leap into the thick of it?
You were in multiple schools, right? What were the schools you were in? What were they like?
Well, at first I thought I understand high school kids and junior high school kids because, they know how to write prose and stuff, and that's what I would want to concentrate on. But the district that I worked for had a need you never knew on a given day, and I thought I should just say any class, any level. And so I got sent to some fifth grade classes, kindergarten classes. I basically taught any class they needed to be taught, and that was a useful thing to do because I felt that I was actually helping. The great thing about having a job is that you're doing something that people need you to do. So I just showed up and taught what they wanted me to teach.
What was your first day like, and did you feel prepared?
Well, I had a very good training program, and I don't want this book to seem to be a criticism of anybody. Figuring out how to teach human beings who are young and restless and talkative anything is a complicated process. But my first day was terrible. My second day was a little better. The worst day I had was a day when I taught fifth grade. I thought, I remember fifth grade. It wasn't that bad, I remember that I remember the books I read. But for some reason, this class, and I was warned, this class is, they say, this class is a little rambunctious. They use certain words like that. And they broke me, and I had to appeal to the principal. And I felt like just an absolute, completely inept human being.
What did they do that broke you?
Internecine squabbling combined with, in the lower grades, they don't want to break you in the sense that of a direct challenge, that here's the substitute, this will be fun, we'll take him down. That happens later. In the lower grades, it's just that the normal rules don't apply.
They're not doing it on purpose.
No, it's as if somebody transferred them to a slightly different atmosphere. And actually, I thought, well, part of my function as a substitute is to give these kids a break from normal routine. So normally you lose recess if you do certain things that are wrong, and there's a whole escalation level of punishments. It's a whole like Cool Hand Luke or something. And here I am. I'm in the class, and I am going to allow you to do things that are maybe a little different. That's a dangerous sort of thing to whisper to kids because, of course, they do things that are different. It was a class that wasn't getting along terribly well. There were factions. The ecosystem of a classroom is so fascinating. I think this is why teachers want to teach, and why when I was a substitute I thought, man, this is the most interesting job in the world, although one of the most difficult. It just feels as if you're in something extremely complicated with all sorts of cross currents and constant interruptions and little passing emergencies, and you are given the task of having to figure it out, sort it out, make 1,000 decisions on the fly.
Did you go into it each day with like a different sort of approach, thinking, okay, this time I'm going to try to be the cool teacher, or this time I'm going to actually try to teach them something that will stick with them for life? I will be Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society, or...
That's such a great... I think you've seen through me. Yes. I mean, here's the point, is that you don't know where you're going because the phone rings at 5:30 in the morning, and then you're told that it'll be second grade or 10th grade English or 9th grade remedial math or whatever it is. I thought about it as I was driving to school. I would eat a sandwich or drink some coffee, eat a banana, and think about, I was, fighting the battles of the day before. I was thinking, what did I do wrong on Tuesday that I will not do wrong on Wednesday? And it almost never worked because Wednesday was so different from Tuesday.
Right. The lessons weren't always applicable. But you said when you went into the 5th grade classroom, you thought, okay, I remember being a 5th grader. When you actually got in there, and of course, as a teacher, not a student, did you feel like this is all recognizable to me? Or did you feel like, wow, kids have changed, schools have changed, I've changed?
Basically, because of ubiquitous video, I think that kids have become very alert, very smart jokesters, and they want to be funny. They know what being funny means. And that's great, that's terrific. But it makes the classroom size a little problem because a class of 20-some kids, all of whom want to be really quick on the uptake and, kind of come up with a topper joke and a quick response, and it makes it really hard to be a teacher. The teachers have to be jokesters too, or else they have to be just iron-throated screamers dealing out punishments. People have the ability to wander the world with their little windows of liquid crystal, and that makes a difference. It clearly does.
It sounds like it makes it much more challenging to maintain authority.
Yes, because what is authority? Why would a substitute have any authority? That was what was so interesting to me going into it, was the substitute is the most vulnerable, most foolish. He is the fool. The substitute walks in the classroom and everybody knows that he knows nothing about what's expected of that class. The substitute, he or she, is lower on the totem pole than the lowest kid on the totem pole. And of course, there's a hierarchy. It does make it kind of interesting to be that person.
So you go in, you're in the classroom all day, you presumably have some work to do at the end of the day in terms of, getting things ready for the actual teacher to come back. How did you feel at the end of the day? Were you wiped out, or did you go home stimulated, ready to write all about it, working on this book?
I went home always in a feeling that it had gone very badly. I parked in a parking lot usually and tried to write down what were the best moments of the day. What was the moment where I actually connected with a kid and taught him something that made a difference? And what were the moments where it just seemed like a complete waste of time? And there's a lot of time waste in classes, obviously. So I was completely wiped out. What happened, though, later was, as I was writing about the whole experience, I realized that this was one of the most interesting, I guess, it was a privilege. It really was a privilege to hear little kids and bigger kids figure out how to use language in a way that was raw and funny and charming. There was sort of a delayed response. The initial response was just simple, completely wiped out exhaustion. I've shouted all day. I've fussed at people. I've tried to get the class cleaned up because I don't want to embarrass myself when the custodians come in. Then there's this later thing of, you just got to live your life in parallel with 20 little people who are figuring it out. And it was so interesting to watch them figure it out. Figure out, generosity, what they're interested, figure out how they can be exciting to other people. That whole thing, it just watching them become people was just a terrific privilege, really.
Did you learn anything new about language or about writing that you then brought back to the act of creating this book?
What I found, what was amazing, was that kids really liked being read aloud to, and they liked fiction. They liked having somebody read aloud Roald Dahl or Stephen King. One of the great successes in high school was the teacher, while I was in ed tech, which is sort of a teacher's aide, read aloud Stephen King's Shawshank Redemption, the story. And they just went quiet. They listened. There's a spell that actual fiction casts, and that I was kind of inspired by, to see this magical thing that happened when I would read sometimes some kind of sentimental story that wasn't terribly good, but sometimes it was one of the great moments, like D.B. White's Charlotte's Web, and they would just go quiet and listen, and it was lovely.
I think you've come up with a very nice idea here where all the novelists of Maine, Stephen King, Elizabeth Strout, you will all go and substitute teach.
Every human being who wants to have an opinion about American education ought to spend some time as a substitute teacher, because your opinions, whatever you come up with in the end, you will feel that you know what you're talking about better because you will have been through the chaos and the disasters and the fires and the misery.
All right. Well, the second best thing will be reading your book about doing exactly that. And I think you'll get many people who might not have read a book about what it's like to be a teacher to read you on what it's like to be a teacher. So, Nick, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. It was a great pleasure.
The book again is Substitute, Going to School with 1,000 Kids by Nicholson Baker.
This is John Williams, an editor at The Times, and I'm joined by my colleagues Greg Cowles and Jenny Schuessler to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hey, guys.
Hey. Hi, John.
So, Greg, what's on your desk this week?
You'll remember that I was reading Herzog while I was on vacation a couple of weeks ago. It's such a big book that I kind of needed a palate cleanser. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I really like to do after I finish a big, sprawling book like that is read collections so that I can kind of dip in and out, whether they're short stories or essays. I thought I'd continue in the Saul Bellow vein, and I went to his collection of nonfiction that was published last year called There's Simply Too Much to Think About. I have to say, not my favorite Saul Bellow. It's I don't know if it's because it's nonfiction or because he's just better writing at that big length. Mm-hmm. There's something very kind of constrained and dutiful feeling about these essays. He's better when he's really putting himself into them, and there was something a little bit homeworky about these.
That's funny.
I read a few of them and then set it aside, and where I landed was I do love to read writers' journals. I keep the journals of John Cheever on my phone to dip into at will, but that's not what I'm reading right now. It's the journals of MFK Fisher. She's, of course, most famous as a food writer, but she's just a terrific writer, full stop. She, especially in her 20s, had a very tumultuous love life. She was married to a guy, Al Fisher, who was very depressive and kind of controlling. And she had this passionate love affair with the guy who became her second husband, Tim Parrish. He was a painter. He was related to Maxfield Parrish. He had also been a volunteer in World War I. He had maybe nerve damage from mustard gas. And this very dramatic, passionate, tumultuous life. But she was such a clear, understated writer that the drama comes out through the story and not through the writing at all. And you just kind of live this with her.
Jenny, how about you? Journals, letters?
I was also recently on vacation, and I went to New Mexico, and I'm sort of a vacation counter-programming reader. Like, people might say, go out and get, grab D.H. Lawrence or Tony Hillerman or finally read the Milagro-Beanfield War. But I kind of like to go elsewhere when I'm going elsewhere. So I picked up on the recommendation of a friend, and as it turns out, most of the critics writing 2 years ago, Rachel Cusk's last novel, Outline, she's a writer I had never actually read. And it was about a woman, a novelist who's in Greece. But the part that I kind of liked about it is that it starts out on an airplane in this kind of intense conversation she's having with the man next to her. And I was on an airplane, and I'm like, there is no way I could have as interesting a conversation with anyone on this airplane. Or maybe I could. I don't know. Then I came back from vacation, and my vacation was over, and I very quickly read, kind of going to the other end of the spectrum, this book called Blood in the Water by the historian Heather Ann Thompson, who I understand is on the podcast next week. And it's about the Attica prison rebellion of 1971 and everything that came after. And it's a truly shocking story.
This was work reading, and we should say
this was work reading. Yeah, I had a story about it. I had a story about it this week, and her which I'm sure she'll tell you all about, her efforts to kind of get as much as she could the full record of what actually happened there, and what many have described as a cover-up that followed. So this is a 600-page book, pretty propulsive, very readable, but still 600 pages, 100 pages of footnotes, which I love footnotes, so I'm not complaining.
But we should urge people to go to, if the 600 pages is too intimidating, your profile of her is excellent and is online now.
Yeah.
And was in the paper earlier this week.
And if you can hang on for God knows how many years, she just got apparently a big movie deal from Hollywood. So will be interesting to see if this is a story Hollywood really wants to tell.
But it is certainly a very dramatic, gripping story. You can see it easily translating to the screen.
Oh, yeah.
Small or big.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I'm hoping that I'm going to put you on the spot and say that, and in exchange for agreeing to be on this podcast segment, I'm going to demand that one of you provide me with an early galley of Zadie Smith's new novel, which I'm hoping to read on my little weekend getaway this weekend.
That is one of the hottest commodities around the office right now. I'm looking for one myself. So you and I are in a pitched battle for the next copy of the Zadie Smith galley that comes in.
Okay, I'm ready for it.
I'm being very intentionally silent over here.
Greg has 7 copies on his desk.
John, what are you reading?
Funny you should ask.
The Zadie Smith galley.
No, I'm reading, actually, I read one thing for work like you did this week, which was a new book called The Art of Rivalry by an art critic named Sebastian Smee, who you may know from your days at the Boston Globe.
He came after my time.
Okay.
But your review is great. I'm very curious about this book.
Oh, thanks. He's a Pulitzer-winning art critic for the Boston Globe, and his new book is about the tensions and the creative breakthroughs in 4 different relationships between artists. Matisse and Picasso, Manet and Degas, Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning, and Lucian Freud and Francis Bacon.
And not John Williams and Greg Cowles?
It stops just short of us. I think his next book is going to be just about us. Okay. He wants to focus a bit more. This is a really good book. He's a really elegant writer and has very smart things to say about their relationships and the ways that they influence their art. And I say in the review, and I'll say here, that at its best, it kind of reminded me, in terms of its insights into interpersonal relationships, of the essayist Adam Phillips, who I'm a big fan of, the psychoanalyst, and about kind of just in patches, just in moments where he kind of touches on what he calls susceptibility, people's susceptibility to each other's influence. And there's also a lot of great art world gossip, and these are outsized characters. I mean, these 8 guys are, and he makes the point in the preface that they are all men, although they're also women who play key roles in the narrative, but that this was at a time when, art was still very kind of patriarchal.
One of the interesting things that you bring out in your review is that in each pairing, he identifies one character who is kind of the extrovert, the wild man, the chaotic one, and one who's much more constrained but is pushed out of a sense of rivalry with the wild one.
Yeah, they want to access their inner wild person a bit more, which I found really interesting. And some of them do it more easily and quickly than others. But in each case, I feel like what the other person is getting out of the relationship is this kind of push toward getting in touch with a more instinctive element of themselves when they're making their work, instead of being so considered and revisionist. And I found that really interesting. Quickly, the other 2 things, one I read in its entirety because it's a very small novel. It's about 100 pages by a woman named Caroline Blackwood, who was it wasn't intentional that I was going to read this. I actually only bought it this week, but it did leap out of the shelf at me because she does make an appearance in the previous book I mentioned. She was married to Lucian Freud, and also later to the poet Robert Lowell. And she came from an aristocratic Anglo-Irish family. And this is a book called Great Granny Webster, which is a very slender novel based on her own life. Time spent with her great-grandmother. In her introduction, Honor Moore calls the descriptions of this sort of giant old family home that the great-grandmother lives in merchant ivory from hell. It's just, cold, and there's bad pheasant being cooked, and it's just dark, and the windows are always drawn even when it's sunny. The writing in it is quite good. It's not a book for fans of plot. It's really just about a woman, much like Blackwood, tracing her family line through these both disturbed and also very repressed women in her family line, while she's also thinking about the father who she never knew, who was killed in war when she was young. So that's Great Granny Webster by Caroline Blackwood. And lastly, speaking of palate cleansers, last week I talked about A Childhood, Harry Cruz's memoir, which I finished this week also, which is fantastic. I called it a book that was too good to fact check, and that put me in mind of a book that I dipped into many years ago called The Dirt, which is Neil Strauss's history of the rock band Motley Crue. And even though at 12 and really stupid, I was a fan of Motley Crue, I'm not really interested in them now, but everyone has always said that this book is an incredibly entertaining read. That is both sort of an understatement. It's a disturbing read. It makes Spinal Tap look like the PBS NewsHour. I mean, it's just, how are these people still alive? How dopey were they to live the way that they lived for so long? But when you're used to reading about, great artists and very literary things, dipping into Motley Crue is a good way to cleanse the brain.
So 50 years from now, will there be a book that's sort of The Art of Rivalry, and it's, Motley Crue versus,
Motley Crue and
Guns N' Roses. You'll
right.
sort of pair up, Tommy Lee and Axl Rose and, David Lee Roth and
I would read that.
Sammy Hagar. I don't know.
I would read that right now.
Is it just like a quickie biography, or is it a true cultural study type?
No. It's not cultural studies. No. It's about 400 pages, so it's not quick. But it's basically an as told to. It's Strauss writing. Each chapter sort of, bops back and forth between the singer and the bassist and the drummer. And he's telling their stories as they told them to him.
Was this before or after he was Neil Strauss was a New York Times reporter?
I think it was during.
Wow.
Yeah, I think he was here at the time. So, Greg, enough about us. What is the general public reading?
Well, over on the hardcover fiction list, there's 4 new titles. 3 of them are in the top 6, so half of the top 6 titles are all new. Those are at number 6, Lisa Scottoline continues her Rosado and D'Annunzio series with a book called Damaged. Then at number 3, Janet Ivanovich and her co-writer Fief Sutton. They start a new series called Curious Minds. That's new at number 3. And at number 2, Sandra Brown has a thriller called Sting, not a biography, not a music biography.
Those are all incredibly familiar names on the list. We should point out that still at number 1 for the third week is Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad.
That's right. Not his third week at number 1. He actually debuted at number 2, but then he jumped to number 1, and he's there for the second consecutive
push.
Yes, exactly. And then over on the nonfiction side, there are just 2 new titles. Down at number 15, a collection edited by Jesmyn Ward, who won the National Book Award for her novel Salvage the Bones. She's edited this collection called The Fire This Time, which you can tell from the title is in reference to James Baldwin, and it is kind of an updated version where contemporary writers take on the issue of race in America. Not the only book about race or class in America. These kind of big political topics are bubbling up all over the list. Still, the Ta-Nehisi Coates has been on the list now for over a year. Between the World and Me is still at number 5 in its 58th week. And then there have been these recent looks at kind of the white underclass with Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. That's at number 2. And Nancy Isenberg's White Trash is at number 10. The other new book on the list this week is all the way up at the top, and it has nothing to do with race or class, per se, but it is Amy Schumer's essay collection, The Girl with the Lower Back Tattoo.
Upper middle back tattoo.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, John.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.